Hey. So, I love helping people to make sense of messes. As a professional information architect, the people who come to me have messes that are so big, so complex, that in a lot of cases, they actually think they can't be made sense of. At the beginning of many of my projects, it's sort of like I'm playing chicken with my clients on whether or not they can scare me away from the assignment. It's sort of like, well, if you thought that was bad, we have this pile of things and this pile of things. And it gets to the point where I kind of find it hilarious that they're trying to convince me that it's too big a mess. So these are some pictures of some of the messes that I have helped make sense of in the last year. And looking at these pictures, you might think, well, this looks pretty familiar, right? This is a pile of Post-it notes. But the interesting thing about this pile of Post-it notes is that these piles represent the hopes and fears and dreams and anxieties of the businesses that I work with. And there's one thing that all of my projects have in common, and it's something that I want to talk to you about today, which is information. So there's this material, right? And this material is to blame for most of the messes that we as designers and technologists face in our everyday work. And this material, I'm sorry to tell you, is not new to the digital world. This material is as old as humanity is. So even though you might be feeling like we're in this information anxiety now, it's something that's been quietly ramping up for our entire existence as humans. Now, the tough thing about thinking about information is that it isn't like other materials that we're taught to use, like brick or glass or even pixels. Information is much sketchier than those materials. It's not something that's so easy to grasp. You can't pick up and put down information the way you can the other materials that we're using in our day-to-day work. In fact, information only exists in the heads of those that interpret our work. Now, I know this can start to sound like a lesson out of college philosophy class, but I want you to bear with me here. Let's take the example of this bakery case. Now, if you're looking at this bakery case, there's some of you in this room who might be believing that the oatmeal raisin cookie is less popular or purchased less often than the chocolate cookie. There's some of you that might have the opposite view on why there is an unequal amount of cookies. And probably most of us can agree that there was most likely, at some point, more than one double chocolate cookie on that plate. But the reality is, you do not know that these things are in fact true. These are stories that you've told yourself. And as Susan talked about today, a lot of this is done very unconsciously. It's something that just happens. And it's something that happens to us millions of times a day. As we go through the world and we encounter holes in our reality, we fill them with these stories. That part is... Oh, why are they not updating? Any ideas? Clickers on. I will use arrows. It's updating over here. Yeah. The arrows are moving on this screen and not on that screen. There we go. All right, cookies. So you guys are like, what the heck is she talking about, cookies? Oh, man. Thank you for telling me, whoever that was, brave soul. So let's go back to this bakery case, right? We have this unequal amount of cookies, oatmeal raisin, double chocolate. Now, the story that we tell ourselves is that there's a reason that there's this unequal amount of cookies, when in reality, we don't actually know why that is the case. And this is the difference between what we call information and content. And it's a really important distinction because if you think about your everyday use of words like that, you can use them synonymously. One means the same thing as the other, when in fact the difference between them is actually quite important. So what this means is that we can't actually make information. All right? Our users do that for us. It's like the content that we create is meant to give them a certain interpretation. And we hope that whatever content we do make ends up the correct information in their head. What this also means is that there's no such thing as true information. There's just the spin of what ends up in our users' minds. And I like this example from the cookies because it's sort of the perfect way of explaining how the arrangement of content combined with subjective data that we individually have access to is what creates information. This means that two users of this bakery case could walk away with completely different interpretations. So the same content begets a multitude of information. So one person might believe that oatmeal raisin is much less popular, while someone else might believe that the double chocolate cookie is much less fresh. Truth really has no place in this story. So when I talk to my clients and my students about information architecture, this is what I try to get across to them. Information architecture is a practice of deciding how to arrange something to support a specific intention. An IA is not directions for how something should look, but rather how it's intended to be perceived. So today, with the time I have, I want to share with you 3 lessons that I've learned as an information architect. And I hope that these 3 can really put you in a good position to make sense of whatever your next mess might be. The first one is that language matters. So I know this can seem like a very obvious statement. We use language all day long with each other to make things clear. But it seems to me that it is the hardest lesson to get organizations to truly understand. I recently worked with a company that had 14 ways to refer to the same one thing. Now, I think it's important when we talk about this story that we all admit that if we sat down on a single day to try to come up with 14 ways to say something, that might actually be really, really difficult to do. No one ever did that. No one sat down and was like, hey, you know what we should do today? We should just make 14 ways of saying the same thing. That would make things really be clear, right? Instead, this is something that happens in silos as organizations grow and change. And this is the reality that most organizations are facing. So I think it's important for us to talk about language because these words, these phrases, these concepts are all over everything. They're all over our help systems, our interfaces, they're in our databases, they're in the meetings that we have with other people as we do our work. And so this becomes really impactful on all parts of your business. And whether or not you have a vocabulary that people understand can be the difference between working well together or being really frustrated. So I want to ask you, if you're going to think about your business context, how many words are used? And to make that a little bit simpler, I want you to focus just on the nouns. Think of all the nouns that you use as a part of whatever concepts you're coming through with design or technology. And then think about your coworkers and what nouns they use. This is a screenshot of an association map that I made for that company with 14 ways of saying the same thing. And at the time, they knew that there was some duplication, but they had no idea that the problem had gotten as bad as it had. And one of the reasons, the catalyst for doing this exercise, was they were about to translate their entire system into 5 additional languages. Now, you all can do the math, 14 ways of saying something, 5 different languages to translate into. All of a sudden, this language, something that is very simple in terms of an asset, becomes very complex to manage. And it becomes a problem from a scope perspective, which is something that we can all understand. And once we're done with the nouns, we still have the verbs to deal with. And this is another place where we see duplication and needless copy and paste of different types of words, right? You might see in one interface it says modify, in another it says edit, in a third you might have that little pen icon, right? This is something that grows with us as we do projects and tackle new contexts. So to clean up a mess like this, we need to start to mine those nouns and those verbs and have careful consideration of whether or not what we're dealing with is a model change or a label change. In some cases, it makes complete sense to have 2 different labels for the same model. But in many cases, we have similar models that are called different things, and over time, people can start to confuse them and think that they are, in fact, very different, like the 14 ways of saying one thing. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not here to tell you that it is your job to make only one label per noun or verb. It's not always the best way to go. There are some cases where the context or audience that you're designing for would actually require very different languages to talk to them. Think about if you were working on something that was supposed to serve patients and doctors, for example. We can see how we might use completely different languages to communicate with them effectively. The goal here is not necessarily to simplify the language. The goal is to know what you mean when you say what you say. So the tool that creates agreement amongst people about what things mean is called a controlled vocabulary. And I'm going to admit right now, this is not the sexiest thing to look at. It is a list of words. But this is the single document that when I deliver this as an information architect, my clients have hugged me, which seems a little weird for a spreadsheet of words. But it seems to me that this is the thing that a lot of people are asking for. They want clarity about what their coworkers mean when they say what they say. And this document is something that can actually provide it. The magic of this list is that it is the list. If you want to disagree with this list, you have to go up against an actual document to say, no, I don't want to use that term. I want to use this term instead. And that's a really powerful centering moment for many organizations. One of the most powerful parts of a controlled vocabulary, in my experience, is not actually the list of words that you say. It's the list of words that you don't say. This list is sort of like the semantic dragons that are flying around in your organization, right? Maybe you're in the design department and you hate it when the marketing people use a certain term. Or maybe there's a legacy term that's floating around that really just ruffles feathers about what used to be the way things that were. By documenting this list, we know what bothers people and we can move past those words. This is an example from 18F, who's been working on a controlled vocabulary for the federal government of the United States. And their premise is simple. They think the government should speak in a language that makes sense to the people who live in our country. Wow, simple, easy statement to make, but delivering it as a document, can you even imagine what kind of semantic dragons they might find? So language is all around us. And without rules for how we can use language consistently, these semantic dragons will reign free and terrorize your organization. So this idea might seem simple enough to not even be needed, and I have heard that excuse a lot. But it also could get you hugged by your next client, so think about that. It's also noted as one of the most important things in complex projects. It's something that as the complexity increases, we lose our ability to keep track of things in our head alone, and documents like a controlled vocabulary become even more important. So my second step, there is no right way. I'm going to clue you in on a little secret. I am not actually an expert in how to organize things the right way. Instead, I am an expert in trying to help people figure out how to organize things their way. And those are different things. If you come up to me after this talk and you show me an interface that I've never seen before and I have no context on your organization, and you ask me how you should organize things, the only thing I'm going to be able to say is it depends. It depends on what it is you want to achieve. So I want to give you an example. Let's say that we were working on a grocery store website. And after some research into how people organize produce, we determined that tomatoes, squash, avocados, and eggplants are not easily discovered by users when classified as fruit. So we decide that we are going to classify them instead, as FreshDirect has here, as vegetables. Now, that's wrong, right? From like a agreeing with science standpoint. But in reality, if we were to pay attention and only organize things according to what science believes to be true, we would be hiding those important things from our users. So it's not wrong that we've chosen to classify these things as vegetables. It's smart. It's something that will make us better and make our users be able to find things. But let's say that we're now asking to organize a website for children about the classification scientifically of produce. All of a sudden, making that same choice would be irresponsible, right? We could still do that same research. We could find out that grade school children believe those things to be vegetables. But to design our interfaces towards what they believe to be true would not be serving our intention of teaching them what science has to teach us. So the way that you choose to organize your produce says something about you. And taxonomy and the way that we group things is actually a tool of rhetoric. It's not something that should just be phoned in or adopted from another context. It's something that becomes a very powerful tool of getting your point across. Now, this means that some websites are architected to get you to pick up the phone, and some mobile apps are architected to get you to go to your desktop or put your phone in your pocket, as Golden had us exploring earlier today. This might seem contrary to our ideas of what a good experience is, but it actually highlights an important idea, that this taxonomy you choose for organize something is one of the most powerful rhetorical tools that we as designers and technologists have access to. And if that decision is not made thoughtfully, you could end up with lost tomatoes. So the only thing that matters in terms of architecting a taxonomy effectively is reaching your goals, getting to the point where you know that you've actually had the effect that you want to have. And if the effect is getting people to put their phone away, there's ways to measure that. If the effect is supposed to be to help people find produce, there's ways of measuring that. But that's the only way. There's not like a secret magic that I'm not telling you in this presentation about the right way to do things. One of the most afflicting causes of taxonomy problems in organizations is something that I like to refer to as corporate underpants. This is when you've decided to organize your website not according to the way users believe things to be true, but maybe by the way your organizational chart is set up, by who owns the content. And I often get comments that this is something that only happens in really big political companies. But this example of it is actually something I found working for an ashram of monks on their website. So it's affecting in organizations of all sizes. The trick that I use to get people over this ailment is to help them to organize their whatever it is at least 2 ways before we decide how to move forward. And it turns out that people often believe that that organizational chart is the only way to organize things. So if I can get them to organize instead by task or topic or audience, often I can get them to see, oh, there's more than one way to do this. And once they've seen that, I have never had somebody go back to the old way of doing things. It just doesn't make sense anymore. It's sort of like once you see the truth, you can never go back. Card sorting, if you haven't heard about it, is one of the most effective ways to start to play with your taxonomy. So if we were going to try to figure out our grocery store website taxonomy with the problem with all those tomatoes, this is one way that we might go about it. We make some cards, we have our users come in, and very quickly we would realize that things like eggplant, which are fruit, are actually classified as vegetables in people's mind in how they grocery shop. So I want to encourage you to be the one that can show that alternative way of organizing something, because often it really is getting stuck in that one way of how we've always done things. And as we start to move out of single channel and into a more cross-channel and multi-channel world of design and technology, this becomes even more important. Because if you're not careful about it, you can end up transferring those taxonomies to everything that you touch. And our third lesson. We need pictures. So it's been my experience time and time again that without something to point to, people will just flounder in a sea of indecision. Or even worse, they will make yet another meeting to discuss how they are floundering in a sea of indecision. This has probably happened to you all as well. One of the best ways to get people out of that mindset is to make a picture of whatever that elephant in the room is. Whatever that scary topic is that everyone's keeping in their head alone, by getting it onto a page, we have something that we can actually kind of address as a team. So as simple as it seems, making pictures of things allows us to get literally on the same page. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about making wireframes and sitemaps. In fact, often the decisions that we need to make are obfuscated by jumping to drawing the solution to an underdefined problem. So instead, I'm talking about pictures that allow us to discuss complex things without relying on people keeping up in their heads alone. So one thing that I think is important in making pictures of things is that we take the time and space that's actually needed to collect and iterate on the information that other people have that we're working with. This is a very large map. This wrapped an entire room in Portland, Oregon, and my client there had been working with a process that was 96 weeks long, and no one had ever drawn a picture of it before. Every person who worked in this 96-week process had their own view of what was happening. There was no way for us to do this in one meeting, right? But often that's the expectation that we put on ourselves. We're gonna have one workshop, we're gonna have this one-day discovery thing, we're gonna get all the information out. If I had tried to get that entire 96-week process documented with my clients on one day, or even in 1 week, we would have all been exhausted. And even worse, I probably would not have gotten the accuracy of information that I was looking for. Once you've taken the time and the space that you need to collect and iterate, it's important that you don't leave all of that intellectual capital just on the wall or in your own head. So it's important that you visualize that thing, right? In this case, that 96-week process was something that was very hard to explain. You'd have to sit down with somebody for days for them to walk through the whole thing. And it turned out that no one person actually had all of that information to give. So I created this diagram. Now, I was really proud of this. This was like, wow, 96-week process. Nobody's ever drawn a picture of it before. That is so cool. Guys, this diagram got us in really big trouble because it made it look like this really complex thing was super simple. And when the interface designers and the developers got a hold of this diagram, they were like, okay, cool. So the interface is going to be like, step 1, do these things. Step 2, do these things, week by week. Well, in reality, the 96-week process for manufacturing a season of goods was something that was staggered, where an employee working through this process was actually working on upwards of 8 or 9 seasons at a given time. So their world was not week 1, do this, week 2, do this. So I republished the document to inspire realistic and not simplistic thinking. And while this is a much messier diagram to consume, it gets across what is real. It tells the technology and design partners that this is not something simple and that one of the complexities of designing for this situation is the overlap of these weeks. And that's the complexity of the people working through this process. So it's important that we have to be careful of reductionism. And oftentimes when we do things like make wireframes, we can reduce what it is that we're working on to just what's on the surface and make it seem really simple. And as we probably all know in this room, something that's very simple to draw on a paper could be very, very difficult to actually make in reality. If you were an alien from a different planet landing here, having no concept of what pizza is, and you were asked to make a pizza based on this schematic wireframe of a pizza pie, where would you put the cheese in relation to the tomato sauce? Would you put the tomato sauce on top of the cheese? That would be pretty gross. Even worse, would you like mix them all up in a bowl and kind of spread it all as one thing? Ew, right? There's all sorts of things that we don't think about when we reduce down. And it's a lot based on what we think people know already. In this case, everybody knows what pizza is. So sometimes we have to show the process and not just the results. And this exploded schematic of a pizza would have much more effect on those aliens being able to translate the concepts into what they were trying to do. So here's the trick to knowing if a picture is needed or not. If you ever have a conversation or a meeting with someone who is using their hands to illustrate a point, they probably have a diagram that is just dying to get out. So be the one that can capture that. as quickly as possible. And once you get people away from the talking with their hands and pointing at the paper instead, you can really start to illustrate what they mean. And it might look a lot different once you get it on paper than what you actually thought in your head. So a good thing to do might be to have everyone draw what they see in their head around a problem and then compare them and then make one single picture. Or if you can't get people to draw, which is definitely a thing that I run into, you can start to draw straw dogs of what you think is in their head so that they can react and say, no, actually, that's not at all what I was thinking. It's important for us to remember that these are not pretty pictures to be presented and sold. I don't think it's productive for you to go into your bat cave and make a diagram for weeks at a time and then come out and be like, ta-da! Right? That doesn't work. I wish that that worked. That would be really fun, but it turns out that that's actually really counterproductive. Instead, we need these diagrams to be messy. And at the beginning of time, we need them to have the intention to change. So don't be protective of your diagrams. Instead, try to make them sort out the problems and complexities that exist on your projects. Because without something to point to, we can't reach agreement. And we've all been on those projects where the world seems to have slowed down our progress and we just can't move forward. That's because the agreement part hasn't been reached. And without agreement, you can make as many wireframes and sitemaps as you want, and you're still not going to have the answer to what you're looking for. One other little hint that I've learned over the years: the person who picks up the marker first owns the project. So if you're looking for that moment to really step up at work, be the one that can capture that monster in everybody's head. You will be the hero of your project. So I hope you're walking away from this talk with 3 key lessons. The first one is that we need to know what we mean when we say what we say. So be the one that can simplify the language used in your organization. The next is there is no right way to organize anything. There is only the way that gets us to our intention. So show an alternative way of organizing something. And last, making simple pictures of complex things is the key to agreement. So make a picture of the monster that's in everybody's head. I also hope that you don't feel like any of the things that I've shown you today or talked about is something that you need a specialist to take care of. Because information architecture is not just for information architects. It's an important practice to understand if you're making anything for other people. And before I leave you, I want to ask a favor of everybody in this room. Please help the world to be a clearer place by spreading the words information architecture to as many people as possible. Without a name for this important practice, people can't get better at it. And it's my belief and my maybe naive hope that if more people understand the importance of lessons like this, we could collectively make sense of the messes that we face in this world.